The mountain did not roar. It exhaled. Cain Ashwaki would remember that detail for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. That the end of the world did not come with thunder, but with a long, patient breath, as if something enormous had been holding it in for centuries and had finally let go. He was sharpening a hunting knife on the back step of Tomas Coalfeather's smithy when the sky over the cinder spine turned the color of a healing bruise. Purple, then yellow, then a black that seems to eat the color around it. The mountain had smoked for 3 days. Nothing unusual, the old folk of Ashwick said. It always smoked before the autumn rains. But on the third evening, the smoke stopped rising and started falling, rolling down the slopes like something poured from a bowl. "That's not smoke," Tomas said, standing in the doorway with a hammer still in his hand. "Smoke doesn't crawl." Cain had been in this body 11 days, long enough to know how to hold a knife the way a hunter's apprentice should, long enough to answer to the name Cain without flinching. Not long enough to stop being surprised by his own hands, broader than the ones he remembered, calloused in different places, a thin white scar across the left knuckles that belonged to a boy who had never once, in this life, gone hungry the way Cain had in his last one. He still didn't know exactly what had happened to him. One life had ended, badly, he suspected, though the memory of it was already softening at the edges like wax. And this one had simply been waiting for him afterward, already in progress, already halfway lived by someone whose name he now wore. He had decided in those 11 days not to waste time being afraid of that. Fear was a luxury for people who weren't hungry. He was never hungry here. He intended to keep it that way. Which was why, when Tomas said, "That's not smoke," Cain was already moving. "Bell," he said. "Ring the bell." "For smoke?" "For that," Cain pointed. The gray wall was no longer a wall on the mountainside. It had reached the tree line. It was coming down through the orchards at the pace of a fast walk, and where it touched, the leaves did not burn. They simply stopped, browning and curling in a silence that felt worse than fire would have. Tomas rang the bell. It did not save Ashwick. Cain understood that later, turning the day over and over in his mind the way you press a bruise to check if it still hurts. Nothing could have saved Ashwick, not really. The village sat in the throat of a valley that funneled the ashfall straight down from the caldera like water down a drainpipe. But the bell bought minutes, and minutes were the only currency that mattered that evening. People ran uphill, away from the gray, toward the stone shrine on the ridge that had stood empty and unused since before Cain's body's grandfather was born. Old superstition said the shrine was proof against the mountain's moods. Old superstition, for once, happened to be right, though not for any reason the villagers understood. Cain ran with them, half carrying Tomas's daughter, a girl of 9 who had gone rigid with terror somewhere around the second hill. He did not remember deciding to carry her. He remembered the ash reaching the edge of the orchard behind them, and the sound the first tree made when it touched. Not a burning sound, not a crackling, but a kind of collapsing hiss, as though the wood itself were being unmade rather than consumed. He remembered Mira Coldwell. She was ahead of him on the path, older than the girl he carried by perhaps 6 or 7 years, dragging her grandmother by the arm and losing ground with every step because the old woman's legs simply would not go faster. Cain did not know her name yet. He knew only that she was going to die on this hill in about 40 seconds unless something changed, because the gray tide moved faster than any of them, and the grandmother's failing legs had put a gap of 20 yards between the two of them and the rest of the fleeing column. He put the smith's daughter down, sat her hard on a boulder, told her, "Stay," in a voice that came out harder than he meant it to, and went back down the slope. He got the grandmother's other arm across his shoulders. He got maybe 15 of the 20 yards back before the ash reached them. It came as a fine, dry rain first, almost gentle. Kane would spend years afterward trying to describe that first contact to people who hadn't felt it, and none of his words were ever adequate. The closest he ever came was telling the ash researcher much later that it felt like inhaling a held breath that was not his own. A presence, not a substance. It went into his lungs, and it did not feel like smoke or dust. It felt like being looked at from the inside. The grandmother screamed. It was not a scream of pain, or not only that. Kane heard something underneath it, a note that was almost words, as if the sound leaving her throat was being borrowed on its way out. She went first. Kane felt her weight change against his shoulder in the space between one heartbeat and the next, felt her go from a struggling, breathing, weeping person to something with no more resistance in it than a sack of grain. And by the time he lowered her to the ground, her skin had already taken on the color of the ash itself, gray shading into black at the fingertips, at the lips, at the corners of the eyes. She had not burned. There was no fire in this. She had simply been unmade, the way the orchard trees had been unmade, from the inside out in under 10 seconds. Kane understood, with the particular clarity that comes in the last calm second before your own death, that he had just breathed the same air. He waited to die. He did not die. What happened instead was worse, in its way, because at least dying would have made sense. The gray went into him and found something already occupying the space it wanted. Kane felt it. There was no other word for the sensation except feeling, though it happened somewhere that wasn't quite his lungs and wasn't quite his mind. Felt the ash reach for him the way it had reached for the old woman, reach to unmake him from the inside the same patient way, and felt that reaching refused. Not blocked, not stopped, refused. The way you'd refuse a stranger's hand held out for a coin you didn't owe them. Something in him, something that had come into this body 11 days ago from somewhere else entirely, something that did not belong to the world the ashes god had claimed dominion over, did not recognize the ashes' authority. The dead god's will passed through Kane and found no purchase, because the soul wearing this body had never sworn it anything, had never been born under its sky, had never been his to claim. And having failed to unmake him, the ash did something Kane would spend the rest of his life trying to fully understand. It stayed. He felt it settle. That was the only word, not burn, not fade, not disperse the way ash should when a breath is done with it. Settle. The way silt settles at the bottom of still water, finding a shape, finding a container. He felt something cold and orderly unfold behind his sternum, unfamiliar geometry assembling itself out of borrowed dust. And in the space of 2 or 3 racing heartbeats he understood, not with words, but with the same wordless certainty that told him his own name, that whatever had just happened to him now had a shape. And the shape was his. The gray tide reached him fully a moment later. He should have died then, too, by every logic the burning trees and the grandmother's gray lips had taught him in the last minute. Instead, the ash parted around him. Not all of it, not gently. He would carry burn-cold patches on his forearms for a week afterward where it grazed him at the edges. But the worst of it, the killing density of it, simply did not touch him the way it touched everything else on the hillside. He stood in a valley of the dead and dying, breathing air that should have unmade him, and something behind his ribs that was not his heart beat once, hard, like a bell being struck. Mira Coldwell found him an hour later, when the gray had thinned to an ordinary gray dusk, and the screaming on the hillside had mostly stopped. not because people had stopped dying, but because there weren't many left to scream. She found him kneeling beside her grandmother's body, not weeping, not praying, just looking. The way you look at a puzzle with a piece missing. "You should be dead," she said. Her voice had the flat, scraped-out quality of someone who has used up an entire lifetime's grief in a single hour and has nothing left to spend on tone. "I know," Kane said. "Everyone who breathed it is dead. Everyone. My grandmother, the Hallards, old Sella." She looked at the gray stains still crusted at the corners of his mouth, the ash she had inhaled and somehow not died of. "Why aren't you dead?" He didn't have an answer that would have made sense to her, so he gave her the only true thing he had. "Something in me didn't let it in." She stared at him a long moment in the ash-gray dusk. Then, because grief and shock make people do strange arithmetic, she simply nodded, as if "something in me didn't let it in" was as reasonable an explanation for surviving the death of a god's breath as any other, and knelt down beside her grandmother to close the woman's blackened eyes. Kane sat with her while she did it. He did not yet understand what had lodged inside him on that hillside. He did not know that the geometry settling behind his sternum was called, in the oldest and most forbidden texts of a cult that no longer officially existed, a vessel, a vault built to hold what a god's dying breath left behind. He did not know that the cold, orderly presence he'd felt assembling itself out of borrowed ash was, in fact, assembling itself out of something far more specific than ash. It was assembling itself, plate by plate, out of the dead. He would learn that within the hour, when he stood to help Mira carry her grandmother's body toward the ridge shrine, and felt something shift and settle across his chest and shoulders like a coat he hadn't put on. A weight that had not been there a minute before, dull gray and faintly warm, fitted to him with an intimacy that made his stomach turn once he understood what he was looking at. A breastplate. Ash gray, seamless, warm as a hand that had only just let go of his. And in it, faint as a held breath, he could feel the shape of a woman who had been afraid of losing her legs before losing anything else, who had loved her granddaughter enough to keep walking long after her body told her to stop. He said nothing to Mira. He did not think, on that first terrible evening, that there were words for what had just happened to him that wouldn't sound like a monster's confession. But he carried her grandmother's weight up the last of that hill, twice, once in his arms, and once, forever, across his chest. And he understood, with the same wordless clarity that had told him his own name 11 days into a stolen life, that whatever he had just become, he was going to have to decide very quickly what to do with it. He tried, once, in the last hour before the shrine's ring of pillars finally came into sight through the falling gray, to remember anything useful from the life before this one. Some fragment of knowledge that might explain a chest that had grown a stranger's armor out of her dying breath. Some precedent his old world might have offered for what to do with a body that had just proven it could hold the dead. He found nothing. Whatever he had been before Cain Ashwake, it had not prepared him for this. He had died once already, he was fairly sure, though the memory of that ending had thinned to something closer to a mood than a story, a sense of unfinished business, a vague, persistent guilt he could no longer attach to any specific face or failure. He wondered, climbing the last switchback with a dead woman's weight settling warm and impossible across his sternum, whether this was simply what happened to souls that died with too much left unresolved. Not rest, not oblivion, but reassignment, dropped into someone else's half-finished story and left to make of it what they could. It was not a comforting thought. He set it aside, the way he was already learning to set aside anything that didn't help him take the next step up the hill, and kept climbing. Chapter 2. The Ridge Shrine. 83 people made it to the shrine. Ashwick, before the mountain breathed, had held just over 400. The shrine itself was smaller than Kane remembered ruins usually being. A single round chamber of black basalt, open to the sky at its center, with a ring of worn pillars that might once have supported a roof and now supported nothing but weather. No one in Ashwick could say, that first terrible night, what god the shrine had originally honored, or why the old stories insisted the ash could not cross its threshold. They only knew that it hadn't, and that 83 of them were alive to be grateful for it, huddled together in the dark with the smell of cooling stone and the metallic tang of the settling ash still thick in the air beyond the ring of pillars. Kane sat near the outer edge, apart from the others by unspoken agreement, and inventoried himself the way he'd once, in some other life, some other set of hands, inventoried a tackle box before a long trip, assessing what he had, what worked, what he could not yet explain. The breastplate had not vanished with sleep the way he'd half hoped it might. It sat against his sternum in the dark, faintly warm, faintly present in a way ordinary armor never was. He could feel, if he concentrated, the ghost shape of a grandmother's stubbornness pressed into the metal like a fingerprint. It was not talking to him. He was relieved about that, at least. But it was not silent, either. It had weight the way a held breath has weight. He did not sleep much that first night. Somewhere around the deep, black hour before dawn, Mira Coldwell came and sat a few feet from him, wrapped in someone else's borrowed cloak, and did not speak for a long while. When she finally did, her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. The elders are saying the ash will settle in a week, maybe 2. Then we go back down, see what's left. A pause. You don't believe that? I don't know enough to believe or not believe it, Kane said, which was true, and easier than telling her what he actually suspected, that whatever god had exhaled itself across this valley was not going to politely finish dying on a schedule convenient to survivors. But you know something. She turned to look at him properly for the first time since the hillside. In the very faint pre-dawn gray, her eyes were red-rimmed but sharp, cataloging him the way he'd been cataloging himself. You didn't die. You're the only person on this ridge who breathed that and didn't die. Old Cobb thinks you're touched by something. Blessed, maybe. Or cursed. He wanted to ask you to leave camp before Tomas told him to shut his mouth. What do you think? Mira considered the question with the same flat, exhausted honesty she'd shown him on the hillside. I think I don't care what you are, as long as whatever's keeping you alive can be pointed at things that want to hurt the rest of us. She wrapped the cloak tighter. I buried my grandmother tonight with a stranger who shouldn't be breathing. I've stopped having room left over for being afraid of the stranger. I'm afraid of the mountain instead. There's only so much of it to go around. It was, Kane thought, one of the most honest things anyone had ever said to him, in either life. He didn't tell her about the breastplate. Not yet. Not because he didn't trust her. Already, after one night, he trusted her more than he'd trusted most people in his old life. But because he didn't yet have words for it that wouldn't make him sound like exactly the kind of thing old Cobb suspected he was. He found out how right Cobb's instincts were 3 days later, when the second death happened. The ash had not, in fact, finished settling in a week or 2. It kept falling, thin and patient, for 11 days. And in that time, the 83 survivors on the ridge became 71, then 64, as exposure and grief and the thin gruel they could scrape from what little food had made it up the hill took their toll on the old, the very young, the already wounded. Kane watched, in growing and specific horror, as each death near him left a mark. It was not every death. That was the first thing he came to understand, turning the pattern over during the long gray days with nothing else to do but think and keep watch. It was deaths close to him. Close enough, he eventually decided, that whatever governed the range was something like 10, 15 paces, though he never tested the edges precisely, because testing would have meant standing near dying strangers with a stopwatch, and even 11 days into this strange, new hunger, he could not make himself do that. An old man named Presh, who had lost most of his family on the hillside and simply stopped eating out of a grief too large to argue with, died on the 9th night while Kane sat a dozen feet away, keeping watch. Kane felt it the way he'd felt the grandmother, a settling, a cold click of new geometry behind his ribs, and woke the next morning to find a second plate had joined the first, smaller, fitted along his left forearm, carrying with it a faint and stubborn sorrow that was not his own. He was, he understood with mounting dread, becoming something. A vessel. A vault. He did not yet have the word the old cult would have used, but he had the shape of the thing clearly enough. He was a container, built by accident, by his own soul's refusal to be claimed, by some cosmic joke he hadn't asked to be the punchline of, to catch what a dying god's power left scattered in its wake. And the raw material of that power was, apparently, whatever a person carried with them when they died close enough for him to catch it. He told no one. He told himself, in the coldest and most honest part of his mind, that this was partly caution and partly shame, because the plates worked. Because on the 12th day, when 3 ash-maddened wolves came down off the ruined slopes and found the ridge camp's thin perimeter, it was Kane who stood between them and the huddled survivors, and it was Presh's stubborn, grieving strength in his forearm, and a grandmother's fierce protectiveness across his chest that let him take a bite meant for his collarbone, and walk away with a scar instead of a corpse. He killed 2 of the wolves with a hunting knife that should not have been able to do what it did that night. He watched old Cobb watch him do it, and understood from the old man's face that whatever protection secrecy might once have offered him on that ridge, it was already gone. "You're carrying something," Cobb said afterward, in front of enough witnesses that there was no pretending otherwise. His voice shook, but it did not waver. "I want to know what." Mira stood beside Kane when he answered. He noticed that and filed it away as something that mattered. "I don't fully know," Kane said, which was still true. "But it's kept 8 of your people alive tonight, who wouldn't be if it hadn't. Decide what to do with that information yourselves." "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm telling you what I know and letting you choose." It did not fix everything. Old Cobb watched him differently after that night, with a wariness that never fully left, no matter how many times Kane's borrowed strength stood between Ashwick's survivors and the mountain's leftover dangers. But it bought him something almost as valuable as trust, a kind of wary transactional peace, the survivors' fear balanced against their need, tipping, for now, toward useful rather than dangerous. Mira did not flinch from him even once. That, too, he filed away. The 14th night brought the first true ash storm, not the slow, patient falling they'd endured since the eruption, but a churning, wind-driven wall of gray that came shrieking down off the caldera with a violence that had nothing gentle left in it. Kane woke to the shrine's ancient pillars groaning under a wind that seemed to be looking for the gaps in the old protective ring the way water looks for the lowest ground, and to Mira's hand already closed hard around his wrist, pulling him upright before his mind had fully caught up with his body. "The hallward lean-to," she shouted over the wind, already moving. "It's outside the ring line by 6 feet. Belle and her boys are still in it." They went out into the storm together, because there was no version of the next several minutes in which Cain considered doing otherwise, and because Mira did not ask him to stay behind, the way half of camp would have expected her to. The ash outside the ring's boundary was not merely falling now. It moved in ragged, hungry gusts, and Cain felt with a new and specific clarity the plates across his chest go taut and cold and alert, the way they had on the very first night, straining toward a danger his body could feel before his mind had fully named it. He found Bell Hallward on his knees in the wreckage of the collapsed lean-to, shielding his two sons with his own back, ash already crusting gray at his collar, his breath already going ragged in a way that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with what the wind was carrying into his lungs with every desperate gasp. Cain did not think. He simply moved, the way Precious borrowed stubbornness in his forearm had taught his body to move without asking permission first, and got himself between the wind and the huddled family, taking the brunt of a gust that should, by every account of what had happened to the Coldwell grandmother 5 weeks earlier, have unmade him on the spot. It did not. The plates held. Cain felt them work in a way he'd never consciously directed before, not passive armor, but something that reached back, faint and grateful, and utterly without words, toward the wind that wanted to claim the family sheltering behind him, and pushed. Bell Hallward lived. Both his sons lived. Cain carried the youngest of the two boys back through the ring himself, ash burned along one forearm where the storm had found a gap in his borrowed protection, and did not fully understand, until Elira arrived weeks later with instruments and careful, patient questions, exactly what he had done in that moment. That he had not merely absorbed the storm's hunger, but redirected a fragment of it, using the plates the way a shield uses angle rather than mass, turning aside what he could not simply endure. Mira found him afterward, sitting apart from the others while Sorrel, not yet arrived in camp, though that night's storm was, Cain would later learn, the very disturbance that first drew her attention down from the ruined sanctuary in the ash-choked hills, was still weeks from crossing into the shrine ring. It was only Mira that night who sat with him, while the storm wound itself out against the old stones, and who said, quietly, into the exhausted dark, "You keep doing that, putting yourself where the worst of it is." "Would you rather I didn't?" "I'd rather you understood that you don't have to earn staying here by bleeding for it every single time something goes wrong." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it Cain hadn't heard from her before. Not quite fear, not quite tenderness, something new that hadn't finished deciding what shape it wanted to take. "You survived the mountain's breath because something in you refused to be claimed. I don't want to watch you spend the rest of this life proving that refusal was worth it, over and over, until it isn't anymore." Cain didn't have an answer for that. Not a good one, not that night. But he noticed, filed away, the way he'd been filing away small, true things about her since the first terrible hillside, that she had stayed the whole night, long after the storm wound down, simply sitting beside him in the dark, as if her presence were its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had finished asking yet. Chapter 3. What walked down from the caldera? On the 17th day, someone came looking for what Cain had become, and it was not Ashwick's survivors who found her. She found them. She came down the ridge path alone, at dusk, wrapped in robes the same ash-gray as the mountain itself, so that for a long-held moment the sentries mistook her for a drift of settling dust given a woman's shape. Cain was the one who saw through the illusion first, not through any special sight, but because the moment she crossed within a certain unmarked distance of the shrine, the plates across his chest and forearm went cold, sharp, attentive, the way a dog's ears come up at a sound only it can hear. "Something's tracking her," he told Tomas, low. or she's tracking something. I don't like the way He still didn't have a comfortable word for it, 3 weeks in. The way this reacts to her. She stopped at the edge of the shrine's old, broken ring of pillars and did not try to cross it. That, more than anything, told the watching survivors she understood exactly what kind of ground this was. "My name is Sorel," she said, into the wary silence, her voice pitched to carry without shouting, the trained voice of someone used to speaking in large, echoing spaces. "I was a priestess of the Ashen Sleep, before the mountain woke, and proved every doctrine I was raised on either badly incomplete or an outright lie. I am not here to hurt anyone." Her eyes found Kane across the gathered crowd with an unsettling directness, as if she'd known exactly where to look before she arrived. "I'm here because something on this ridge is doing what my order always claimed only the God himself could do. And I need to see it before I decide whether to be afraid of it or grateful for it." Old Cobb, predictably, wanted her turned away at spear point. It was Mira, of all people, who argued otherwise, pointing out with the same flat practicality she'd shown Kane on the first terrible night, that a woman who'd served the mountain's own god might be the only person within 100 miles who could tell them what, exactly, they were dealing with. They let her into the ring, under guard, at dusk. Sorel studied Kane for a long time before she spoke again, not rudely, but with the unhurried, cataloging attention of a physician examining a wound she'd only read about in old textbooks. Up close, she was younger than her voice had suggested, no older than Kane's own borrowed body, with ash-pale hair cropped short in a style that spoke of practicality rather than vanity, and eyes the particular flat gray of a sky before snow. "You're a vessel," she said finally, and the word landed in Kane's chest with the click of a lock, finally finding its key. "A living vault. I didn't think it was still possible." The old texts said the last true vessel died over 200 years ago, and that Veloth's church buried the knowledge of how it happened along with him, on purpose, because a vessel is... She stopped herself, visibly reconsidering how much to say to a room full of frightened strangers holding spears. "Say it," Kane said. "I'd rather know what I am from someone who has words for it than keep guessing." Sorel looked at him a moment longer, weighing something Kane couldn't read, and then she told him, told all of them, in the flat, gray shrine light, with the mountain's dead god's ash still settling somewhere out beyond the pillars, the shape of the thing that had lodged itself inside him on the worst night of his second life. "Veloth was the god of endings," she said. "Not death, exactly. Endings. The moment a candle's flame finally, fully goes out. The last breath in a body. The final page of a story no one will finish reading. My order worshipped him because we believed endings deserved reverence, not fear. That something sacred happened in the moment of completion, and that sacred thing shouldn't simply be allowed to scatter and vanish unmarked." Her mouth twisted, something bitter and grieving crossing her composed face. "We were wrong about almost everything else, it turns out. Veloth did not die a natural death, whatever piece my order preached about endings. He was killed, murdered, deliberately, by something the old texts refuse to name directly. And when a god that governs endings is ended himself, the power he held over every ending in the world doesn't simply vanish with him. It scatters. It goes looking for something to finish the job he can no longer do himself." "The ash," Tomas said, quiet with dawning horror. "The ash," Sorel agreed. "Every person it touched and killed, it was doing what Veloth's power always did, closing them out, completing them, the way it once would have done gently over a lifetime at its proper hour. Except a dying god's last breath does it all at once, to everyone in its path, without mercy or timing or grace." She looked back to Kane. And a vessel is what happens when that power touches a soul it cannot claim. A soul from outside its authority. Instead of ending you, it settles in you. And it keeps doing, in a smaller, contained way, what it always did. It gathers endings. It keeps them. It wears them as protection. Because that is the truest nature of what an ending is, when you strip away the fear we usually wrap around the word. A completion. A thing finished and kept, rather than lost. The shrine was very quiet when she finished. "You're telling me," Cain said slowly, "that every time someone near me dies, I get stronger. I'm telling you that you were built, by pure accident, by a foreign soul's stubborn refusal to be claimed, into something that was never meant to exist. A living reliquary for a murdered god's last power." Sorel's flat gray eyes did not waver from his. "The last true vessel my order's records describe went mad within a decade. Not from evil, from grief. Because he understood, as you're beginning to understand right now, that his strength was measured in the deaths of people he cared about. And there is no way to carry that weight without it eventually crushing you. Unless you find some way to carry it that isn't only weight." "Is there a way?" For the first time since she'd crossed into the ring, Sorel looked less like a woman delivering doctrine and more like a person admitting she didn't have all the answers. "I don't know. I came down from the ruins of my order's sanctuary looking for exactly that question, not an answer to it. I felt Veloth's scattered power gathering somewhere on this ridge 3 days ago, the way I once felt the god's presence during rites, and I came to see what it had become." She glanced briefly at Mira, at Tomas, at the wary ring of survivors who'd kept Cain fed and armed, and in their fashion, trusted for 17 days. "Whatever it's become, it isn't what the old texts warned me to expect. You're still yourself. That matters more than you know." "For now," old Cobb muttered, not quite under his breath. "For now," Sorel agreed, without flinching from the accusation in it. "I'd like to stay and see how long for now lasts, if you'll allow it." They allowed it. Cain suspected, watching the wary councils that followed over the next several days, that they allowed it mostly because Sorel's knowledge was too valuable to turn away, and partly because turning away the one person who might understand what Cain was becoming felt, to survivors already stretched thin with loss, like exactly the kind of short-sighted fear that had let so many of them die on the first terrible night. Sorel proved, in the days that followed, to be more useful than even her own modest claims suggested. She knew things about the ash that no one else on the ridge did, which patches of settled gray were merely inert and which were still hungry, how long it took a given fall to fully finish completing whatever it touched, how to read the wind for the difference between ordinary dust and the god's leftover breath. Twice in the first week she steered foraging parties away from drifts that looked, to untrained eyes, entirely safe. And she watched Cain. Not unkindly, there was something almost gentle in the way she catalogued him. The careful attention of someone documenting a small miracle she was terrified to disturb. But constantly, in a way that made Mira's jaw tighten more than once when she thought no one was looking. "She talks about you like you're a book she's reading," Mira said to him, on the 9th evening of Sorel's presence in camp. The two of them sitting at the shrine's outer edge in the particular blue hour after sunset, when the ash-choked sky put on its one truly beautiful color of the day. "She's not wrong to," Cain said. "I am, a little. A book neither of us has finished." Mira was quiet a moment, turning something over. "Does it bother you? Being studied?" "Less than it should, maybe." He considered his own honesty before he offered it to her. 3 weeks ago, I didn't know what I was going to become. She's the first person who's given me language for it instead of just fear or use. I don't know yet if that's comfort or just a different kind of danger. "But it's not nothing." Mira looked at him for a long moment in the fading blue light, and something in her expression, grief-worn, careful, no longer entirely guarded, settled into a decision Kane couldn't quite name yet, though he would come to understand it very well in the weeks that followed. "Just don't let being studied replace being known," she said finally, standing, brushing ash dust from her knees. "There's a difference. I'd rather you have both." She left him with the mountain's dead breath settling gray across the darkening sky, and the plates along his chest and forearm carrying their small, silent weight of the people they'd once belonged to. And for the first time since the eruption, Kane let himself believe that whatever he was becoming, he might not have to become it entirely alone. Sorrel found him alone the next morning, testing, carefully, cautiously, out of his own unease rather than any instruction, the outer edge of whatever range governed the plate's hunger. He walked, step by measured step, away from a sick and failing goat that Tomas had already resigned himself to losing before dawn, counting paces, trying to find the distance at which the cold, attentive click behind his sternum finally went quiet. He found it at 19 paces. He did not test it further than that. Standing at the boundary of his own strange geometry, timing an animal's death against his footsteps, was already further than his conscience wanted to go. And he turned back toward camp with a queasy, unsettled feeling he did not examine too closely. "You're troubled," Sorrel said, falling into step beside him without asking permission, in the manner she'd adopted since the shrine's wary council had granted her leave to stay. "I was measuring how close I need to be to a dying thing before it becomes mine," Kane said. "I don't think there's a version of that sentence that isn't troubling." Sorrel was quiet for a moment, her flat gray eyes tracking the goat pen in the middle distance with an expression Kane was coming to recognize as her particular brand of careful honesty. "May I tell you something my order taught, that I no longer know whether to believe?" "Please." "We taught that Veloth did not take endings. He received them. There's a difference, we said, between a thief and a keeper. A thief takes what was never offered. A keeper simply makes certain that what was already ending is not lost to nothing, not scattered without meaning once it's gone." She glanced sideways at him. "I don't know if that's true anymore. I don't know if it was ever true, or only a comfortable story my order told itself to make an uncomfortable doctrine easier to live inside. But I've watched you for 9 days now, and I have not once seen you go looking for an ending to claim. Every plate you carry came from a death you didn't cause and couldn't have prevented. That distinction matters to me, even if I can't yet promise you it will matter to everyone who eventually learns what you are." "And if it stops being true?" Kane asked. "If the day comes where being close to a death is convenient, instead of just accidental?" Sorrel didn't answer immediately, and when she did, her voice had gone quieter, more careful, the voice of someone setting down a warning rather than a comfort. "Then I would want you to remember this conversation, and ask yourself honestly which version of the story you're telling. A keeper or a thief who's grown comfortable with the difference no longer mattering?" She held his gaze a moment longer than was entirely comfortable. "I don't think you're there. I think it's worth being afraid of the day you might be, regardless." It was not comfort, exactly, but Kane found, walking back into camp beside her with the sick goat's fate still undecided behind them, that he preferred it to comfort. Comfort would have been easier to stop believing, later, when the days grew harder. A clear-eyed warning, offered honestly by someone who had every reason to fear what he might become, and chose instead to simply watch and wait, was a sturdier thing to carry forward. The goat died before nightfall. Kane felt the plate settle. Small, faint, carrying nothing so complex as a human grief, only a simple animal stubbornness that would, weeks later, help him hold his footing on a collapsing slope he had no business surviving. And he did not go looking for it. It found him, the way all of them had, because he happened to be near enough for the finding. He decided, that night, that Sorel's distinction was the one he would try to live inside, for as long as the world allowed him the choice. Chapter 4. The Ash Broker's Price. Word travels strangely after a catastrophe. It moves along the roads that are still passable, carried by traders desperate enough to risk the ash-fallen country for the inflated prices grief-stricken, resource-starved survivors will pay. And by the fourth week after the eruption, word had reached Ashwick's ridge camp in the shape of a single wiry man leading two heavily laden mules up a switchback trail that most sane travelers were avoiding entirely. His name, he announced with the easy confidence of a man who'd introduced himself to hostile strangers many times before and lived to do it again, was Sabo. He called himself, without any apparent embarrassment, an ash broker. A dealer, he explained, in the specific and newly lucrative trade of things that had survived the eruption and things that hadn't. Information, mostly, he said, unpacking dried meat and medicine and a small, careful assortment of tools onto a blanket for the survivors to barter over, his eyes moving across the ridge camp with the quick, assessing habit of a man who made his living noticing things other people missed. Goods when I can get them, but mostly these days, information. Because half the roads between here and the capital are choked with rumor, and the other half are choked with people willing to pay well to know which rumors are true. He was, Kane came to understand, within an hour of watching him work, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with weapons. The danger of a man who traded in knowing things, and who had clearly already noticed in the first 10 minutes of his arrival that something about the tall young man standing watch at the shrine's edge did not add up the way an ordinary hunter's apprentice should. Sabo did not say anything about it directly, not at first. He was too practiced a trader for that. Instead, he worked the camp for 2 full days, selling what he had, buying what little the survivors could spare, gathering the small currency of local gossip the way he clearly gathered everything, patiently, without appearing to try very hard. He found Kane alone on the 3rd evening, at the edge of the shrine ring, and sat down beside him without asking, in the manner of a man who had decided, correctly, that the invitation would be granted. "You're not from around here," Sabo said, without preamble. "None of us are, anymore. Ashwick doesn't exist below this ridge." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Sabo's eyes, sharp under a weathered brow, did not waver. "I've traded this valley for 11 years. I knew Ashwick's hunters, its smiths, its whole roster of unremarkable, ordinary faces well enough to nod to most of them by name. You are not one of the faces I knew, wearing a name I recognize. And more than that," he tilted his head, considering his next words with the care of a man handling something that might bite. "There's a weight to you. I've traded with 3 separate God-touched mercenaries in my time, men and women who carried a fragment of some minor divinity's blessing into battle for coin. You have that same weight, bigger if I'm any judge, and the survivors here treat you like something between a soldier and a superstition, which tells me they know it too, even if none of them are keen to explain it to a stranger with mules." Kane said nothing for a long moment, weighing the danger of honesty against the near certainty that a man this observant would find out the truth regardless, one way or another, and would likely do it in a way far less controllable than simply being told. "What would you do with the truth if I gave it to you?" he asked, finally. Sabo's answer surprised him with its bluntness. "Sell it, probably. Carefully. To people who'd pay well and wouldn't immediately try to kill you for it. Because dead sources don't generate repeat business, and I'm a businessman before I'm anything else." He shrugged, unbothered by his own honesty. "But I'll tell you something else, for free, because it's worth more to you right now than anything I could sell you. There's a rumor already moving on the eastern roads, 3 days old, maybe 4, about a survivor of the cinder spine eruption who breathed the god's ash and lived. No name attached yet. No description beyond young man, Ashwick Village. But rumors like that don't stay vague for long. And the people most interested in tracking down a living survivor of Veloth's death breath are not the kind of people you want finding you before you're ready for them. Who's asking? Sabo's easy trader's smile thinned, just slightly, into something more careful. The Cinder Faith? What's left of it anyway? The parts of the old church that didn't die with their god, and have spent the last 4 weeks trying very hard to understand what's happened to the power they used to worship. He glanced briefly toward the far side of the ring, where Sorel sat cleaning a set of ritual implements with the quiet, habitual focus of someone who'd done the same task 1,000 times before the world ended. I'd imagine your priestess friend over there could tell you more about that than I can.
I'd imagine she already has, if she's half as forthcoming as her old order's reputation would suggest she isn't. He was right, of course, and Kane learned the rest of it from Sorel herself that same night, in a conversation that stripped away the last of the comfortable distance he'd allowed himself to maintain from the scope of what he'd survived. The Cinder Faith split after Veloth died, Sorel told him, her voice carefully even, the tone of someone reciting a wound rather than reliving it. Most of the order simply stopped, the way a body stops when its heart does. Faith without a god to anchor it doesn't survive contact with proof of his death for very long. But a fragment remained. The ones who decided Veloth's murder demanded not grief, but restoration. They believe, or claim to believe, that enough of his scattered power gathered in one place could be used to rebuild him, reconstitute him, bring him back, in some form, from the ending he was forced into before his time. Her flat gray eyes met Kane's, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw something like fear move behind them. You are, as far as I can tell, the single largest concentration of Veloth's power currently existing anywhere in this world. If the remnant Cinder Faith learns what you are, not rumor, not vague description, but confirmed, located, understood, they will not ask you politely to help them. They will take you apart to get what they want out of you, and they will tell themselves sincerely that they are performing a holy restoration while they do it. The shrine was very quiet. How long do I have? Kane asked. Before they find you specifically? I don't know. Weeks, maybe. Rumor takes time to sharpen into certainty. Sorel's hands, Kane noticed, had gone very still around the ritual implement she'd been cleaning. But I'd rather you spend those weeks becoming something they can't simply take apart, than spend them hoping the rumor stays vague forever. Vague rumors have a way of finding the people who most need them to stay vague, and finding them anyway. The conversation with Sabo, and the one that followed with Sorel, marked, Kane understood only in hindsight, months later, the true end of the first phase of his second life. Before that night, he had been a survivor, learning the shape of an accident that had happened to him, tending to the people who'd tended to him in turn. After it, he was something closer to a target, with a very short window in which to become something other than easy prey. He did not sleep well that night. Mira found him still awake near dawn, sitting at the ring's edge with his knees drawn up, and did not ask what was wrong. She had learned, in the weeks since the eruption, to read the particular quality of his silences. Sabo told you something, she said instead, sitting beside him, close enough that her shoulder rested against his. Sorel confirmed it. He told her all of it, the Cinder Faith, the Restoration Doctrine, the rumor already sharpening on the eastern roads. He had by now stopped weighing whether Mira deserved the full truth of what he carried. Some decision had settled in him, unspoken weeks ago, that she did. She was quiet for a long time after he finished, watching the gray pre-dawn light gather itself over the ruined valley below the ridge. Then we stop waiting to see what you'll become, she said, finally. with the same flat, unblinking practicality that at first made him trust her, on a hillside full of the dead. And we start deciding it instead. The camp council convened the next evening, the first time in 5 weeks that every surviving adult on the ridge gathered in one place with something like a formal purpose, rather than the loose, exhausted drift of shared grief that had governed their days until now. Old Cobb ran it, by unspoken agreement, in the flat, procedural voice of a man who had buried 3 grandchildren in the last month and had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of that grief, that competence was the only grief work still available to him. "Sabo's rumor puts us on a clock," Cobb said, without preamble, once the camp had settled into its ragged half-circle around the fire. "Whatever's left of the Cinder Faith learns what we're sheltering here, and they will come for it, whether that means coming for him," a nod toward Kane, careful, not unkind, but not warm either, "or coming for all of us, if they decide the rest of Ashwick makes useful leverage." "Then we move," said one of the Hallward cousins, a woman named Petra, who had lost her husband on the first night and had spent the 5 weeks since arguing consistently for whatever course of action promised the most distance between Ashwick's survivors and the mountain that had killed him. "Further from the Cinder Spine, toward the capital roads, where there's at least a garrison to hide behind. And bring the very thing they're hunting straight into a crowded city full of people who'll have no idea what they're sheltering or what it might attract?" Tomas's voice, when he spoke, carried the particular weariness of a man arguing a position he took no pleasure in holding. "I don't love the alternative any better, but I don't think moving solves the actual problem. It just changes whose lives are on the line when the problem finds us." The argument went on for the better part of an hour, circling the same handful of impossible choices from a dozen angles, and Kane sat through most of it in a silence he was beginning to understand as its own kind of decision, because every path the council debated assumed, at its foundation, that he would be present to walk it alongside them, and no one, not even Petra in her sharpest moments, suggested otherwise. 5 weeks ago he had been a stranger with a knife and 11 days of borrowed memory. Tonight, without anyone quite announcing it, he had become part of the ledger the camp weighed its survival against. It was Sorrel, finally, who offered the shape of an answer no one else in the circle had the specific knowledge to propose. "The Cinder Faith remnant isn't large," she said, into a lull in the argument, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone speaking from the inside of the thing being discussed. "I left before the split fully calcified, but I knew the doctrine, and the doctrine of restoration only ever attracted a narrow, fervent core, the kind of believers who'd rather see their God returned wrong than not returned at all. They will come with conviction, but not with numbers. Not yet. If Kane is what I believe he is becoming, not merely a vessel, but a vessel who can be trained, strengthened, made genuinely difficult to simply overpower, then the calculation the Cinder Faith makes when they finally do find this ridge changes considerably. Difficult prey invites caution. Caution buys time. Time is the only resource any of us actually have enough of to spend right now. You're suggesting we stay, Cobb said, and get stronger, instead of running. I'm suggesting running without a destination that solves the actual danger is just a slower version of standing still. Sorrel's flat gray eyes moved around the circle, unflinching. I can't promise safety. I can promise that hiding a growing vessel behind an unremarkable name in a crowded, unprepared city is a worse plan than keeping him here, on ground we understand, with people who already know what he is and have already decided, whatever their fear, not to abandon him for it. The council did not reach a clean decision that night. Camps of grieving, frightened survivors rarely do. But by its ragged, unofficial end, the balance had tipped, again, toward staying. Toward hardening what they had,
Rather than fleeing toward an uncertainty that traded one danger for another, they understood even less. Cain understood, walking away from the dying fire alongside Mira in the deep chill of the night, that the decision had cost the camp something it could not easily get back. A kind of last, fragile innocence about what Ashwick's survivors had actually become, 5 weeks after the mountain exhaled. Not merely refugees anymore. A camp organizing itself, however roughly, around the defense of something the wider world would very much like to take from them. "They chose you," Mira said quietly as they walked. "Tonight." However it looked from inside the argument, that's what happened. "They chose the version of staying that doesn't get more of them killed," Cain said. "I'm not sure that's the same thing as choosing me." "It's close enough," Mira said, "that I don't think you should spend too much time arguing yourself out of it." Chapter 5. What the Ash Remembers. The 5th week brought the last of the people who would matter, though Cain did not know it yet, watching a second stranger climb the switchback trail toward the ridge camp with none of Sabo's easy confidence, and all of a scholar's single-minded focus. Her name was Elira Voss, and she arrived not looking for shelter or rumor or trade, but for data, a word she used so often in her first hour at the camp that Tomas's youngest son took to repeating it under his breath like a private joke. She was, she explained to the wary sentries who intercepted her, an alchemist and natural philosopher formerly attached to the Royal University's Materia faculty, and she had spent the last month conducting the single most dangerous research project of her career, cataloging, sampling, and attempting to understand the physical and metaphysical properties of Veloth's scattered ash, in defiance of every safety protocol her former colleagues had begged her to observe. "They said it couldn't be studied safely," she told Cain, less than an hour after her arrival, with the particular bright, unbothered intensity of someone for whom "couldn't be done safely" had never once been a satisfying answer. They were almost entirely correct. I've lost 2 research assistants and most of my left forearm's original nerve sensation to samples that behaved less predictably than the literature suggested they would. She held up her left hand, flexing it with visible, clinical curiosity rather than distress, revealing skin gone a faint, permanent ash gray from wrist to first knuckle. But almost entirely correct leaves room for genuine understanding, if one is careful and extremely well documented about the ways in which one is wrong. And you, vessel boy, are the most significant data point to emerge from this entire catastrophe. She said vessel boy, the way another person might have said fascinating specimen, entirely without malice, and Cain found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't mind it. There was something almost restful about Elira's particular brand of attention, after weeks of being regarded as either a weapon, a superstition, or a target. She looked at him the way she might have looked at an unusually complex alchemical reaction, with fierce, focused delight, and absolutely no fear at all. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Ash sign tracking. Veloth's remnant power leaves a trace in the air itself, if you know how to read it, a kind of metaphysical residue, thinner than smoke, that concentrates wherever the power has recently gathered or been used." She was already unpacking instruments from a satchel that seemed, improbably, to hold twice what its size suggested it should. "I've been following concentration gradients across 3 counties for 2 weeks, expecting to find, at best, an unusually potent ashfall site worth sampling. Instead, I find a gradient that terminates in a person, sustained and active, rather than decaying the way an ordinary fall would. Do you have any idea how significant that is?" "I'm beginning to," Cain said with real feeling. Sorel and Elira did not, predictably, take to each other immediately. The priestess's careful, reverent framework for understanding Veloth's power sat uneasily against the alchemist's brisk, dissective curiosity, and their first several conversations produced more friction than insight. But within days,
a grudging, productive rhythm emerged between them regardless. Sorel supplying the doctrinal and historical context Illyra's university training had never touched. Illyra supplying the rigorous, testable framework Sorel's order had never thought to build. Between the two of them, over the following fortnight, Kane learned more about what he'd become than he had in the entire month preceding their arrival. He learned that the plates gathering across his body were not, as he'd feared in his darkest early moments, simple trophies of grief. That each one carried, alongside its weight, a genuine fragment of capability, drawn from the person it had come from, latent and accessible if he learned to reach for it properly. Precious' stubborn refusal to stop moving, tested and confirmed in a careful, consensual exercise Illyra insisted on documenting in obsessive detail, translated into a real and measurable endurance beyond what his body alone should have carried. The grandmother's fierce protectiveness sharpened his reflexes, specifically and only, Illyra noted with delight, in moments when someone near him was in danger. He learned more soberly that Sorel's warning about the mad vessel of 2 centuries past was not exaggeration. Illyra's instruments, calibrated against Sorel's doctrinal knowledge, showed a slow, steady accumulation of something neither of them could fully name, a kind of resonant pressure building behind the geometry of the plates, growing very slightly with each new addition that both women agreed, with rare unanimity, represented real and rising danger if left unaddressed. The voices, Sorel said finally, on an evening when the 3 of them sat late around the ring's small fire, start as impressions, feelings that aren't quite yours, surfacing at odd moments. You'll know them when they come. You've likely felt the beginnings already, if you're honest with yourself. Kane thought of small, strange moments over the past weeks, a flare of protectiveness toward Tomas's daughter that had felt, in its intensity, faintly foreign. A stubborn refusal to stop during a difficult climb that had arrived less like his own decision and more like someone else's insistence, borrowed and worn like the plates themselves, and said nothing, which was answer enough for both women watching him. It doesn't have to end the way the old records describe, Illyra said, with the particular fierce optimism of someone who had built her entire life's philosophy around refusing to accept couldn't be done safely as a final answer. But it will, unless we find a way to give you something the old vessel never had. Not just a container for what you're gathering, a way to actually carry it, to integrate it rather than simply accumulate it. I don't yet know what that looks like, but I intend to find out, and I would very much like your permission to make finding out the central project of what remains of my scholarly career. Kane looked between the 2 of them, the priestess who'd lost her god and found in him a strange and unlooked-for continuation of something she'd once revered, the alchemist who'd lost 2 assistants and a portion of her own nerve sensation and found in him the single most significant discovery of a career built on refusing easy answers, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the plates at all. You have it, he said. Both of you. Whatever you need from me to understand this properly, you have it. Mira, sitting a little apart from the fire's light with the particular watchful quietness she'd carried since Sabo's warning first reached the camp, said nothing for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the wariness Kane half expected, and all of the flat, grounding practicality that had first drawn him to trust her weeks ago on a hillside full of the dead. Good, she said. Because whatever you're becoming, I'd rather you become it on purpose, with people who actually understand what they're looking at, then let the Cinder Faith be the ones who finish deciding it for you. Illyra's first formal testing session took place 3 days later, in the flat gray light of an early morning she'd insisted on for reasons involving instrument calibration that Kane understood perhaps a third of at best. She had converted a cleared stretch of ground just inside the shrine ring into something between a laboratory and a training yard,
Copper rods driven into the earth at careful intervals, small ceramic dishes of reactive powder arranged in a pattern Sorel had approved after 2 full days of doctrinal cross-referencing, and a battered, much-repaired journal already a third full of notation in a cramped, rapid hand. "I want to establish 3 things today," Elira said, circling him with the brisk, unself-conscious focus of a woman entirely in her element. "The precise boundary of your gathering range, under controlled rather than accidental conditions. The rate at which a given plate's latent capability becomes consciously accessible to you versus simply passive. And whether there's any meaningful difference in plate quality based on the manner of the death that produced it, sudden versus lingering, violent versus peaceful. That last one matters more than it sounds like it should. If quality scales with suffering, that has implications for what kind of person you're at risk of becoming, whether or not you'd ever choose it." "That's a cheerful morning's agenda," Kane said.
Understanding is never as cheerful as ignorance. It's simply more likely to keep you alive. Elira didn't look up from the instrument she was calibrating. "Belle Hallward has agreed to let me test the boundary using controlled distance from the goat pen's newest patient. A second animal, elderly, already dying of natural causes, nothing hastened. I want to be extremely clear that I do not conduct research that requires hastening and ending. That line matters to me as much as it should matter to you." The morning's work confirmed the 19-pace boundary Kane had found on his own, refined it to within a stride's accuracy, and established, to Elira's visible, fierce satisfaction, that the boundary was not fixed but responsive, tightening under stress and calm, widening very slightly in moments where Kane's attention was actively extended outward, toward people he was consciously trying to protect. "That's not merely mechanical," Sorel said quietly, watching the day's results accumulate in Elira's cramped notation. "That's intentional. The range isn't simply a property of the vault. It's responsive to what you want it to do." That's not in any text I've ever read describing the old vessel. "Which means," Elira said, with the particular brightness of a scholar watching her hypothesis survive contact with evidence, "that this isn't purely passive accumulation, the way the historical record assumed it had to be. There's a directive component. Something in you is choosing, even at a level below conscious thought, how wide a net to cast." She looked up at Kane with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from clinical fascination towards something more careful. "That's either extremely good news, because it means you have more control over this than the old records suggest anyone in your position ever had, or it's the first sign of exactly the danger Cyril warned you about. Because a vault that can choose to reach further is a vault that could, someday, choose to reach further than its bearer intends." The testing continued through the afternoon, methodical and careful, and by evening, Elira had filled another dozen pages with notation, sketched diagrams of plate distribution across Kane's body that Cyril cross-referenced against half-remembered doctrinal descriptions, and extracted from Kane himself a growing, cautious vocabulary for sensations he'd previously only had wordless impressions of. The difference between a plate's passive warmth and its active reach, the particular quality of borrowed stubbornness versus borrowed protectiveness, the faint, specific ache that came from holding more than his body had originally been built to carry. It was Mira, arriving at dusk with food neither Elira nor Kane had remembered to eat, who finally called a halt to the day's work. "He's not one of your reactive powders," she said, not unkindly, setting the food down with the particular firmness of someone who had decided the conversation was over, whether or not anyone else agreed. "He gets to stop being data for the night." Elira, to her credit, accepted the correction with genuine grace, closing her journal with only a small, visible reluctance. "Fair. Tomorrow, then. There's a great deal more to understand, and I intend to understand all of it. But not, I concede, tonight." The rumor Sabo had warned them about reached its sharpened certainty 17 days later, though none of them knew it yet, sitting together in the relative peace of a camp that had,
against every reasonable expectation the first terrible night should have taught them, begun to feel almost like something that could last. Kane had grown, in those 17 days, more comfortable in the strange new architecture of himself than he'd believed possible 5 weeks earlier. Sorel's doctrine giving shape to what he carried, Illyra's rigor giving him language for how to carry it, Mira's steady, unflinching presence giving him something to carry it for, beyond mere survival. He did not see the rider on the Eastern Ridge Road, 3 miles out and closing, wearing the gray and bone vestments of a faith that had supposedly died with its God 5 weeks before. He did not yet know the name, Inquisitor Drathan, or the particular, patient cruelty of a doctrine that believed restoration justified any cost paid to achieve it. He knew only, that evening, sitting at the shrine's edge, with Mira's shoulder warm against his, and the ash-choked sky finally, for one held breath, allowing a thin band of ordinary blue to show through at the horizon, that whatever came next, he would not be facing it as the frightened, friendless survivor of the first terrible night. He would be facing it as something the mountain's dead god had never intended to create, carrying the strength of everyone he'd refused to let vanish unmarked, standing beside people who had chosen deliberately, at real cost, with open eyes, not to let him carry any of it alone. Above them, beyond the ridge, the rumor that had been sharpening for a month finally found its shape and began, patiently, to climb the mountain road toward Ashwick's last survivors.